What if the single most important factor separating the people who build lasting wealth from the people who spend their entire lives chasing it has nothing to do with education, family background, timing, or access to capital, but instead lives entirely inside the architecture of how a person thinks? Napoleon Hill spent 20 years interviewing over 500 of the wealthiest and most successful individuals in American history, men like Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, and Thomas Edison, and what he found in every single one of them was not a business secret. It was a mental pattern, one that almost no one around them shared. Napoleon Hill published Think and Grow Rich in 1937. In the depths of the Great Depression, when the idea that thought could produce wealth sounded almost offensive to a nation defined by scarcity and loss. It became one of the best-selling books of the 20th century and has remained in print for nearly 90 years. The reason is not nostalgia. It is because the psychological principles Hill documented have been validated repeatedly across generations of high achievers in every industry. This book is not about positivity. It is about the precise mental mechanics that translate desire into financial reality. By the end of this analysis, you will understand why most people's relationship with money is being sabotaged by a mental pattern they never chose and may not even be aware they carry. You will also discover the one practice Hill identified that nearly every wealthy person in his study performed daily, a practice so simple it sounds almost embarrassing, and yet so consistently applied among the ultra-successful that its absence may be the clearest explanation for why most people never close the gap between where they are and where they intended to be. Subscribe to the Book Vault right now and hit the like button. This channel exists to give ambitious thinkers the edge that changes everything. The Strategic Breakdown Desire. The starting point of all achievement, we begin at the foundation of Hill's entire framework, the chapter he calls Desire, and the opening argument here is one that most people misread entirely. Hill does not mean the casual wish for a better life. He does not mean the vague hope that things will improve. He means a consuming, obsessive, white-hot fixation on a specific financial target, held with the clarity of an amount, a deadline, and a plan, and then pursued as if the outcome were already inevitable. Carnegie described this quality in himself as a force he could no more turn off than he could stop breathing. Ford called it the engine behind every decision he ever made. Hill documents the story of Edwin Barnes, a man who arrived at Thomas Edison's laboratory with no money, no credentials, and no prior relationship with the inventor, and announced that he intended to become Edison's business partner. He was laughed at. He was given a menial job sweeping floors. He waited. He studied. He observed. And years later, when Edison developed a product his own sales team had dismissed as unsellable, Barnes stepped forward and proposed to sell it. He did. And the partnership was formed. Barnes did not have talent, connection, or capital. He had one thing, an unrelenting desire so specific and so sustained that circumstance eventually bent toward it. The dangerous misconception most people carry into this chapter is the belief that desire alone, without a plan, is fantasy. Hill does not disagree, but he argues the sequence matters more than most people realize. The plan always follows the desire. It is never the other way around. The person who waits until they have a perfect plan before committing to a desire is waiting for something that will never arrive without the commitment first. And what I'm about to tell you in the next chapter is the part of this book that most people read, but almost no one actually applies. Faith, visualization, and belief in attainment. The second pillar Hill introduces, and the one that separates the framework from simple goal-setting theory, is the chapter on faith, which Hill defines not as a religious concept, but as a psychological state of absolute certainty that a specific outcome will occur. He argues that faith is not a feeling you wait to receive. It is a condition you deliberately manufacture through a specific mental practice. The mechanism he describes is the repetition of a clearly defined desire statement, spoken or written with emotional intensity, until the conscious mind stops debating the outcome and the subconscious mind accepts it as an instruction to act on. This sounds like it belongs in the category of wishful thinking, but consider what Hill actually documented. Henry Ford was told by every engineer surrounding him that a V8 engine cast as a single block was mechanically impossible. He did not argue with them. He did not pretend they were wrong. He simply refused to accept impossibility as the final answer and kept demanding they find a solution. Months passed. His team failed repeatedly. His engineers told him again it could not be done. He told them to keep working. The engine was eventually produced. Ford's faith was not blind optimism. It was a strategic refusal to let current conditions define future outcomes. The pattern interrupt here is sharp and worth sitting with. Most people believe faith requires evidence. Ford believed evidence followed faith. These two orientations produce completely different careers, completely different bank accounts, and completely different relationships with what is possible. The person waiting for proof before they commit to a vision will always be overtaken by the person who commits to the vision and then builds the proof. Hill called this one of the most misunderstood principles in the entire book. And the next chapter reveals the precise daily mechanism to which faith is engineered rather than hoped for. Autosuggestion, the medium for influencing the subconscious mind. The third principle Hill introduces is the one most readers encounter with skepticism and most successful people apply with discipline, and it is called autosuggestion. The concept is this: the subconscious mind does not distinguish between a thought that has been installed deliberately through repetition and a belief formed through lived experience. Both function as operational instructions, which means that a person who repeatedly plants a specific, emotionally charged message into their subconscious mind through daily practice is, over time, literally reprogramming the instructions their nervous system uses to filter opportunity, generate ideas, and determine what action is possible. Hill prescribes a specific ritual. You write down your financial goal with precision, the exact amount, the exact date by which you intend to acquire it, and the specific service or value you will provide in exchange. You then read this statement aloud twice daily, once before sleep and once upon waking, with as much emotional intensity as you could generate. The emotions are not decoration, they are the activation mechanism. Hill argued that a thought delivered without emotion reaches the subconscious as noise. A thought delivered with genuine feeling registers as command. This distinction is why most people who try affirmations report no results, and why a small number report dramatic ones. The research behind this is more robust than Hill's era could fully articulate. Neuroscience has since documented that the brain's reticular activating system, the mechanism responsible for filtering what information reaches conscious awareness, is calibrated by the beliefs and priorities held at the subconscious level. In practical terms, two people can walk through the same environment and encounter completely different opportunities, not because the opportunities are different, but because one person's mental filter is programmed to see them and the other person's is not. Autosuggestion, practiced consistently, is the deliberate act of recalibrating that filter. What comes next builds directly on this foundation in a way most readers never anticipate: specialized knowledge. Personal experiences or observations, we arrive now at the chapter where Hill dismantles one of the most comfortable excuses in every ambitious person's internal narrative, and he does it through the chapter on specialized knowledge. The argument Hill makes here challenges the reverence most people hold for general education. He observed that the wealthiest people he studied were not necessarily the most broadly educated. They were the most strategically knowledgeable about one specific domain, and more importantly, they surrounded themselves with people who held complementary knowledge in areas where they were personally deficient. Henry Ford famously had access to a button on his desk that could summon any expert in any field within minutes. When critics called him ignorant for not knowing certain facts, he pointed to that button. This next idea is the reason this book has stayed relevant across nearly 9 decades of economic change. Hill argues that the form education takes matters less than the function it serves. General knowledge, broadly accumulated, rarely translates directly into wealth. Specialized knowledge, applied strategically toward a specific definite aim, almost always does. The question Hill asks every reader is not how much do you know. It is whether the knowledge you currently possess, combined with the knowledge you can access through your network, is sufficient to execute the plan attached to your definite major purpose. If not, the gap is not a reason to stop. It is the next item on the acquisition list. The implication that most people miss is about identity. Hill is not suggesting you become an expert before you begin. He is suggesting that the acquisition of specialized knowledge is itself part of the work, not a prerequisite to it. The person who waits until they know enough to start will wait forever, because the standard of enough is defined by fear rather than by function. The person who starts and acquires knowledge in real time builds something the classroom version of the same person never will, the compound advantage of applied learning. And what the next chapter reveals about the imagination is the piece that makes all of it scalable. Imagination, the workshop of the mind. The chapter Hill dedicates to imagination is one of the most strategically underappreciated sections in the entire book, partly because the word itself has been colonized by the creative arts, and partly because Hill is making a precision financial argument that most readers float past without fully landing on. He distinguishes between two forms of imagination: synthetic imagination, which recombines existing ideas and concepts into new arrangements, and creative imagination, which operates at a level that appears to generate genuinely novel ideas through what Hill calls infinite intelligence. Whether you accept the metaphysical framing or not, the practical point is undeniable. The people who build extraordinary wealth almost always see a configuration of value that others, looking at identical circumstances, simply do not see. Hill documents the case of a man who purchased an old farm that contained a simple stream. He noticed that city residents paid for entertainment. He noticed the stream could be dammed. He noticed land surrounding a small lake had value. Within months, he transformed a low-value agricultural property into a profitable recreational destination. The circumstances had not changed. The raw materials were identical to what every previous owner had possessed. What changed was the imaginative reconfiguration of those materials toward a purpose no prior owner had conceived. This is synthetic imagination operating at a financially productive level, and Hill argues it is available to anyone willing to train it deliberately. The hidden truth buried in this chapter is uncomfortable for people who identify as practical or realistic. Hill observed that the most financially successful individuals he studied were, almost without exception, also the most aggressively imaginative. They did not treat imagination as a luxury or an indulgence. They treated it as a professional tool, something to be exercised daily, applied to specific financial problems, and used to generate options that pure analysis could not produce alone. The person who stops imagining new configurations of their assets and capabilities has placed a ceiling on their wealth that no amount of harder work will ever lift. Organized planning, the crystallization of desire into action. At the 14-minute mark of this analysis, we enter the chapter where Hill's philosophy transforms from internal architecture into external execution, and it is the chapter on organized planning. This is where desire, faith, and imagination are converted into a specific, actionable structure. Hill argues that no plan is permanent, and no first plan is likely to be correct. The willingness to create a plan, execute it, observe its results, and revise it without emotional attachment to its original form is the behavior that separates temporary setbacks from permanent failure. Temporary defeat, he insists, is not failure. It is feedback from which a better plan is extracted. Hill's most striking observation in this chapter concerns the nature of leadership. He identifies the qualities that characterize every person who has built and sustained a large financial enterprise: unwavering courage based on knowledge of self, self-control, a keen sense of justice, definiteness of decision, definiteness of plans, the habit of doing more than paid for, a pleasing personality, sympathy and understanding, mastery of detail, willingness to assume responsibility, and cooperativeness. He is not describing personality traits. He is describing a behavioral standard that can be practiced, measured, and improved. Every quality on that list is a choice made repeatedly until it becomes identity. Most people design plans around their current resources and their current confidence. What they just heard sounds complete. It sounds like the full picture of how organized planning works. But Hill introduces something in this chapter that almost no reader stops to fully absorb. He argues that the person who cannot find a plan to make their desire achievable with existing resources is not at a dead end. They are at an invitation. The plan you need may require a resource you do not yet have, which means the next move is not to reduce the desire to fit the plan. It is to expand the plan to acquire the resource. That single inversion changes the strategic posture of every ambitious person who genuinely receives it. The subconscious mind. The connecting link. There is a chapter near the end of Hill's framework that ties every previous principle together into a single operating mechanism, and it is the chapter on the subconscious mind. Hill describes the subconscious not as a passive storage facility for memories and beliefs, but as an active transmitting and receiving station, a bridge between the finite individual mind and a larger field of intelligence that he believed connected all minds. Whether you frame this in spiritual or neurological terms, the operational implication is the same. The quality of the instructions you deliver to your subconscious mind through the emotional intensity and repetition described in autosuggestion directly determines the quality of the ideas, impulses, and opportunities that surface in your conscious awareness. Hill argues that the subconscious mind operates around the clock, working on the problems and desires that have been emotionally embedded into it, generating solutions during sleep, during rest, during the gaps between conscious effort. This is why so many of the most significant breakthroughs documented among his subjects arrived not during concentrated work, but in moments of relaxed alertness, in the shower, on a walk, in the half-conscious state just before sleep. The subconscious does not stop working when the conscious mind takes a break. It processes most efficiently when the conscious mind gets out of the way. The deepest insight Hill leaves inside this chapter is the one most readers reach and move past without absorbing its full weight. He writes that the subconscious mind will act on any dominant thought held with sufficient emotion, whether that thought is a desire or a fear. It does not evaluate. It does not filter for what you consciously want versus what you consciously dread. It simply executes the instruction most consistently and most emotionally delivered to it. This means that the person who spends more daily mental time worrying about financial failure than visualizing financial success is, in Hill's framework, actively programming their subconscious toward the outcome they fear. That is not a comfortable observation, but it may be the most important one in the entire book. The Brain and the Sixth Sense. The Door to the Temple of Wisdom. We arrive at the final chapter of the Strategic Breakdown, the chapter where Hill reaches the deepest and most challenging territory in the entire book, and he calls it The Brain and the Sixth Sense. Hill believed, based on his research and his conversations with some of the most extraordinary minds of his era, that the human brain was capable of receiving ideas and impressions that could not be explained by conventional sensory input alone. He called this the creative faculty, a capacity that becomes accessible only after the other 12 principles have been practiced long enough to produce a conditioned mental state receptive to something beyond analytical reasoning. Hill describes the practice of what he called his invisible counselors, an exercise in which he would, before sleep each night, hold an imaginary council with the historical figures he most admired, men like Lincoln, Edison, Darwin, and Carnegie, and conduct a mental conversation with each, asking questions about the problems he faced and listening to the answers his imagination generated on their behalf. Over time, he wrote, the figures in these sessions began to behave in ways he had not consciously programmed, offering perspectives and insights that surprised him. He was not claiming supernatural contact. He was describing a disciplined engagement with the deepest layer of his own intelligence, accessed through the architecture of imagination, applied to the most formidable minds he could conceive. The chapter lands as the full resolution of everything Hill set out to explain, not as mysticism, but as the natural endpoint of a specific psychological discipline practiced with consistency across all the preceding principles. And the final question it leaves is the one that has followed every serious reader of this book for nearly 90 years. If the mental architecture that produces extraordinary wealth is documentable, learnable, and available to anyone willing to practice it, then why do so few people actually build it? The answer to that question lives not in this chapter, but in the one place most people never look with sufficient honesty. Key lessons and insights, definiteness of purpose, is the price of admission. The first lesson this book teaches, and the one Hill repeats with greater insistence than any other, is that a definite major purpose is not a nice addition to an ambitious life. It is the non-negotiable prerequisite for everything else the framework produces. Hill observed across 500 interviews that the absence of a clear, specific, emotionally committed financial goal was the single most reliable predictor of financial mediocrity. Not lack of talent, not lack of opportunity, not poor timing or bad luck. The absence of a target precise enough to aim at is what most people never confront as their real problem. Here is where the first open loop from the beginning of this analysis finally closes. The mental pattern that separates the wealthy from the rest is not intelligence, charisma, or even work ethic in isolation. It is the combination of a specific desire with an unshakable belief in its attainment. Practice daily through deliberate mental repetition until the gap between the current condition and the desired one becomes not a source of discouragement, but a source of creative pressure. That pressure is what generates the ideas, the plans, the relationships, and the decisions that close the gap. Without the specific desire, there is no pressure. Without the pressure, there is no movement. The mastermind principle multiplies individual capacity. The second lesson Hill encodes throughout the book, and one of the most structurally powerful in the entire framework, is what he calls the mastermind principle. Hill defines the mastermind as the coordination of knowledge and effort between two or more people working toward a definite purpose in a spirit of harmony. He argues that when two minds come together in perfect alignment around a shared aim, a third mind is created that is greater than the sum of its parts. Andrew Carnegie attributed his entire fortune not to his own genius, but to his ability to assemble and coordinate a mastermind group of 50 men who collectively possessed the knowledge and capability his vision required. The practical application of this lesson is direct and actionable. Identify the 2 or 3 people in your current life whose knowledge, perspective, and ambition most complement your own, and begin meeting with them regularly with a defined purpose. Not casual conversation, but a structured exchange around a shared financial or professional objective. The quality of your mastermind determines the ceiling of your results. Most people underestimate this consistently. The brilliant individual working in isolation is outpaced repeatedly by the moderately talented individual embedded in the right group. Hill saw this pattern so frequently across his research that he elevated it to a primary law of achievement rather than a secondary strategy. The subconscious executes. What emotion installs, the third lesson Hill builds toward across every chapter, and the one that resolves the second open loop planted at the beginning of this analysis, is the understanding that the subconscious mind is the mechanism through which all the other principles eventually produce physical results. The one practice Hill identified in nearly every wealthy person he studied was a daily, emotionally intense engagement with their definite major purpose, not as a reminder, but as a programming instruction delivered to the subconscious with the same seriousness a commander delivers an order to a soldier. The subconscious does not question the instruction, it executes it. The practical application is to write your specific financial goal in one sentence and then spend 5 minutes every morning and every evening reading it aloud with genuine emotional investment, not performance but feeling. Connect the statement to the specific emotion the achievement would produce: freedom, security, contribution, pride. The emotion is the carrier signal that moves the thought from the conscious to the subconscious level. Without it, the practice is just words. With it, the practice is a daily recalibration of the mental filter through which you perceive the world, deciding what opportunities register, what ideas surface, and what actions feel available to you. That recalibration, compounded over months, produces outcomes that look like luck from the outside. Persistence is the direct application of will to desire. The fourth lesson Hill teaches with memorable force is that persistence is not a character trait some people are born with. It is a practiced response to the specific internal experience of resistance. Hill studied failure closely and identified the 4 primary reasons most people never achieve their financial goals: lack of a definite major purpose, lack of sufficient ambition to pay the price success demands, insufficient knowledge of specialized subjects, and the inability to persist through temporary defeat. Of these 4, he considered the last the most devastating and the most common because temporary defeat is so frequently mistaken for permanent failure. The practical application requires a specific reframe that must be consciously practiced until it becomes automatic. Every time you encounter an obstacle or setback in the pursuit of your financial goal, resist the instinct to interpret it as evidence that the goal is wrong or that you are insufficient for it. Instead, ask one question: what information does this setback contain about what the next iteration of my plan should look like? This is not optimism. It is operational intelligence. Hill documented case after case of individuals who stood one step from success at the moment they quit, not because they lacked ability, but because they interpreted temporary resistance as permanent signal. The ability to distinguish between the two is the skill that persistence actually refers to. The price of riches is paid in advance. The fifth and final lesson embedded throughout the entire structure of Think and Grow Rich is the one Hill returns to most quietly and most insistently, and it is this: wealth is not acquired and then earned. It is earned and then acquired. The price is always paid before the result arrives. The study hours, the discipline, the daily mental practice, the relationships cultivated, the plans drafted and revised, the temporary defeats absorbed and learned from, all of it comes before the financial result is visible. Most people want the evidence of success before they pay the price of it. Hill calls this the fundamental misunderstanding that keeps most people permanently separated from the wealth they say they want. The practical application closes with the most important question this book ultimately asks of every reader. Not what do you want to achieve, but what are you willing to pay for it, specifically, daily, over the sustained period required before results become visible. Hill found no exceptions to this principle across 500 interviews. Every fortune he documented had a price attached to it that was paid consistently and in full before the fortune materialized. The person willing to pay that price in advance without requiring proof that payment will produce the result is the person for whom the result eventually, inevitably arrives. The vault closing, Think and Grow Rich, is not ultimately about money. It is about the relationship between the mind and the life the mind constructs around itself. Hill spent 20 years documenting the invisible architecture of extraordinary achievement, and what he found was not a set of tactics or a business strategy. It was a psychological discipline, practiced daily by people who had decided with absolute certainty what they wanted and had committed to paying whatever it cost to get there. The book endures not because it is comfortable. It endures because it is accurate, and accurate, in the hands of someone willing to apply it, is the rarest and most valuable quality a book can possess. Here is the one action you can take within the next 7 days. Write a single sentence stating the specific financial amount you intend to earn, the specific date by which you intend to earn it, and the specific value you will deliver in exchange for it. Keep the sentence to 2 or 3 lines. Make it precise enough to be measurable. Then read it aloud every morning and every evening this week with the full weight of your genuine emotional commitment behind it, not as an exercise in positive thinking, as a deliberate daily instruction to the subconscious mechanism that Hill spent a lifetime documenting. 7 days of that practice will not change your bank account, but it will change something more important. It will change what your mind considers possible. If this analysis reached something real in you, do 3 things right now. Like this video, subscribe to the Book Vault, and drop a comment below telling us the single idea from Hill's framework that hit hardest for you personally. And here's where the second thread from earlier in this analysis finally lands. The reason most people never close the gap between where they are and where they intended to be is not external. It is the daily unconscious repetition of a story about their own limits that they never chose and never questioned. The Book Vault exists for the people who have decided to question it. That is the community you are joining when you subscribe. We will see you in the next one.